The enforcer stepped toward her, whiskey on his breath, prison ink on his arms, and said, "Lady, you got 10 seconds to turn around before this gets uncomfortable." She didn't move. She just stood there holding a folded piece of leather against her chest like it was the only thing keeping her upright. The room erupted in laughter. Someone called her lost grandma. Another guy made a joke about breaking a hip. But she didn't flinch. She looked the enforcer dead in the eye and said, "I drove 400 miles to be here tonight. I'm not leaving until I've done what I came to do." Then she unfolded the vest, and the entire room realized they'd just betrayed something sacred. The enforcer was the first to move. Big guy, probably 6'3", neck tattoos, knuckles scarred from years of bad decisions and worse conversations. He stepped toward her with that slow, confident walk men use when they're used to people backing down. Someone near the pool table muttered something crude. Laughter rippled through the crowd. She didn't flinch, didn't smile, didn't apologize. She just stood there in the doorway, calm as Sunday morning, and asked one question. "Is the road captain here?" More laughter, louder this time. Someone mimicked her voice in a high-pitched squeak. Another guy raised his beer and said something about letting Grandma have a seat before she broke a hip. The enforcer grinned, looked back at his brothers for approval, then turned to her again. "Lady, you got about 10 seconds to turn around before this gets uncomfortable." She didn't move. Instead, she reached into the canvas bag slung over her shoulder and pulled out a folded piece of leather. Dark brown, cracked with age, stitched by hand. She held it against her chest for just a moment, like she was gathering strength, then slowly began to unfold it. The enforcer's grin faded. Not all the way, but enough. Enough that you could see the question forming behind his eyes. One of the older men sitting at the bar squinted at her. There was something in the way she carried herself. Not arrogance, not fear. Something else. Something familiar. Like the echo of a conversation he'd had decades ago, but couldn't quite remember. The room was getting louder now. Restless. Someone threw a dart at the board, and it stuck with a sharp thunk. A couple of guys were placing bets on how long it would take for her to leave. The bartender, a heavy-set man with a scar running down his left cheek, leaned against the counter and shook his head. He'd seen this before. People who didn't belong wandering in, thinking they could just talk their way out. It never ended well. But she wasn't leaving. She stood perfectly still, the folded vest pressed against her chest, her eyes scanning the room like she was looking for someone specific. The enforcer took another step forward, close enough now that she could smell the whiskey on his breath, see the faded prison ink on his forearms. "I'm not going to ask again." Her voice was steady, quiet, but it cut through the noise like a blade. "I drove 400 miles to be here tonight. I'm not walking out until I've done what I came to do." There was something about the way she said it. Not a threat, not a plea, just a statement of fact. The kind of certainty you only hear from people who've already made peace with whatever comes next. The enforcer hesitated. For the first time, he looked uncertain. He glanced back toward the corner of the room where the chapter president sat watching, his face unreadable in the dim light. The president, Troy Madsen, waved his hand in a lazy circle. Let her talk. Let her make a fool of herself. Then get rid of her. But before the enforcer could say another word, Evelyn began to unfold the vest. Slowly, deliberately. The leather creaked as it opened, old and stiff from years of storage. And as the back panel came into view, the room started to shift. Before we continue this story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what happens next isn't just about respect. It's about the kind of history that doesn't make it into the news, the kind of loyalty that outlives the men who built it, and the moment when an entire room of dangerous men realized they'd made a mistake they couldn't take back. Her name was Evelyn Calder. Friends used to call her Red, back when her hair still had color and her husband was still alive. She wasn't born into the life. Didn't grow up around bikes or bars or brotherhood. She was a schoolteacher from a small town in Ohio, The kind of woman who baked pies for church fundraisers and taught fourth graders how to multiply fractions. Her childhood was simple, predictable, safe. She went to college, got her teaching degree, moved back to her hometown, and figured that was it. That was the life. She'd marry someone safe, have kids, retire with a pension, and fade quietly into old age. Then she met Frank. Frank Calder came back from Vietnam in 1971 with a Purple Heart, a limp he'd never talk about, and nightmares that woke him up screaming 3-4 times a week. The VA gave him pills. The pills didn't work. His family told him to get over it. The neighbors whispered that he just needed to find a job and settle down. Stop living in the past. Move on. Be normal. He couldn't. The world felt too loud, too fast, too full of people who didn't understand what it was like to watch your friends die in mud halfway across the world while the country you fought for called you a monster on the evening news. He'd wake up at 3 in the morning drenched in sweat, convinced he could still hear the choppers overhead, still smell the burning fuel, still see the faces of the men he couldn't save. So he did what a lot of men like him did back then. He found a motorcycle, found a group of other men who understood what it meant to carry weight no one else could see, and he rode. The club he joined wasn't famous, wasn't trying to be. It was small, local, built on the idea that some men needed a place where they didn't have to explain themselves, where silence was respected and loyalty wasn't just a word you said, it was a thing you lived. The founding members were all veterans, all broken in different ways, all trying to figure out how to exist in a country that didn't want to look them in the eye. They called themselves the Iron Ghosts, not because they wanted to be invisible, but because that's how the world already treated them. Like ghosts, like men who'd already died overseas and just hadn't had the decency to stop walking around yet. Frank didn't talk much about the war. Evelyn would ask him sometimes, gently, trying to understand what he'd been through. But he'd just shake his head and stare out the window. The only time he ever opened up was after a long ride. There was something about the road that loosened the grip the memories had on him. Something about the wind and the engine and the feeling of moving forward that made the past feel a little more distant. On the back of that bike, with his brothers riding beside him, he didn't have to explain why he flinched at loud noises, or why he couldn't stand being in crowds, or why some days he couldn't get out of bed. The wind drowned out the voices in his head. The road gave him a reason to keep moving forward. And the men riding next to him understood that some things don't need to be said out loud. Evelyn didn't understand it at first. She thought it was dangerous, reckless, a way to avoid dealing with real life. When Frank told her he was joining a motorcycle club, she cried. She begged him to reconsider. She told him he was throwing his life away, that he was choosing strangers over her, that she couldn't just sit at home wondering if he was going to come back alive every time he rode out. They fought about it for weeks. She threatened to leave. He told her he wouldn't stop her. It was the closest they ever came to ending things. Then one night, Frank came home after a long ride, and he smiled. Actually smiled. For the first time in months. His eyes were clear. His shoulders weren't hunched. He kissed her on the forehead and told her he loved her, and for the first time since he'd come home from the war, she believed he meant it. And she realized something. The club wasn't taking him away from her. It was giving him back. So she stopped fighting it. She started asking questions, started learning, started showing up, and slowly, without even realizing it, she became part of it too. They got married in 1973. Small ceremony, just family and a few brothers from the club. Frank's best man was a guy named Joel Rains, one of the original members, a Vietnam vet himself who'd started the club after his own brother died by suicide 6 months after coming home. Joel was the kind of man who didn't say much, but when he did, people listened. He had a scar that ran from his left ear down to his collarbone, a souvenir from a bar fight in Saigon that he never talked about. He didn't trust the government, didn't trust civilians who thanked him for his service but wouldn't hire him for a job, didn't trust a system that sent boys to war and then forgot about them the moment they came home. He trusted the men who'd bled beside him and the ones who understood what it meant to live with ghosts. The club became Frank's family. And because Frank loved Evelyn, the club became hers too. They didn't treat her like an old lady in the way some clubs did, like property or decoration. They treated her like someone who mattered. She learned to ride on the back of Frank's bike, learned the hand signals, learned which bars were safe and which ones you avoided, learned that brotherhood wasn't about blood. It was about showing up, about being there when the world told you to walk away. She went to funerals for men she barely knew. She cooked for club cookouts. She held the wives of men who came home from rides they almost didn't survive. And slowly, without even realizing it, she became part of something bigger than herself. She learned what it meant to belong. The years passed. Frank got better. Not healed, because men like him don't heal, but better. He found work as a mechanic. Evelyn kept teaching. They bought a small house on the edge of town with a garage big enough for 2 bikes. On weekends, they'd ride. Sometimes just the 2 of them. Sometimes with the club. Long rides through the desert, stopping at roadside diners, sleeping under the stars. Those were the good years. The years when it felt like maybe, just maybe, they'd survive the worst of it. But then came 1984, a Saturday night in July. Frank was riding back from a club meeting in Barstow. He was alone. Evelyn had stayed home because she had papers to grade. The drunk driver ran a red light doing 70 in a 45 zone. Frank never saw it coming. The impact killed him instantly. The driver walked away without a scratch. Got 6 months in county jail and a suspended license. That was it. 6 months for taking a man's life. When Evelyn got the call, she didn't cry, didn't scream. She just sat down on the kitchen floor and stared at the wall. And for the first time in her life, she understood what Frank had meant when he said some things break you in ways you can't explain. The funeral was small, quiet. Just her, a few family members, and the brothers from the club. They rode in formation to the cemetery, engines rumbling like thunder, a final salute to a man who'd found peace on 2 wheels. Evelyn stood at the graveside in a black dress, holding a single rose, watching as they lowered the casket into the ground. She thought that would be the end of it. She'd bury her husband, sell the bike, move on. Try to rebuild a life that made sense without him. But the night of the funeral, Joel showed up at her door. It was late, past midnight. He looked older than she remembered, tired, lines on his face that hadn't been there a year ago. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there on the porch, holding Frank's cut in his hands. His vest, the one with the patches he'd earned, the club colors he'd worn with pride. She stared at it, her hands trembling. I can't take this. Joel's voice was firm, gentle, but firm. This doesn't die with him, and neither does what he stood for. She looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. What am I supposed to do with it? Joel placed his hand on her shoulder. You keep it. You protect it. And when the time comes, you'll know what to do. Evelyn kept that vest for 40 years. Wrapped in cloth, stored in a trunk in her bedroom, untouched but never forgotten. She'd open the trunk sometimes, late at night when she couldn't sleep, and just look at it. Run her fingers over the stitching. Remember. And she kept the promise she made that night. She just didn't know when she'd have to fulfill it. Until 3 weeks ago, when Joel called her for the last time. Now here's what you need to understand about outlaw motorcycle culture. There are rules. Not the kind written down in some charter you can Google. The kind that get passed down rider to rider, chapter to chapter, earned through blood and time. You don't wear another man's patch unless you've earned it. You don't disrespect a cut, even if the man wearing it is your enemy. And you sure as hell don't mock someone carrying history you don't understand. But that's exactly what was happening in Riverside that night. Because to the men in that bar, Evelyn was just an old woman. They didn't know who Frank was. Didn't know Joel. Didn't know that the leather she was holding had been stitched together in a garage in 1969 by men who'd survived things most people only see in movies. Why would they? The original club, the Iron Ghosts, had dissolved in 1979. Some members died. Some went to prison. Some just rode off into the wind and never came back. The club had been small to begin with, maybe 30 members at its peak, and by the late 70s it was down to a dozen. Joel tried to keep it together, but the world was changing. Clubs were getting bigger, more organized, more territorial. The Iron Ghosts were old school. They didn't deal drugs, didn't run guns, didn't extort businesses. They just rode. And in a world where everything had a price, that made them obsolete. So they voted to dissolve. Better to end it with honor than watch it rot from the inside. The younger generation didn't know the history, didn't care to learn it. They wore patches because it gave them power. Respect became something you took, not something you earned. And that's how you lose the soul of what brotherhood is supposed to be. The Hells Angels chapter that controlled Riverside now was younger, louder, more concerned with reputation than respect. They wore the name. They wore the colors. But they'd forgotten something important. They'd forgotten that the real power in outlaw culture doesn't come from fear. It comes from legacy. From knowing that the men who came before you bled for something you're now taking for granted. And Evelyn was about to remind them. The chapter president was a man named Troy Madsen. Mid-40s, thick beard, dead eyes. The kind of eyes that had seen too much and felt too little. He'd been in the club for 15 years, patched in after doing time for aggravated assault. The story was he'd beaten a man nearly to death outside a bar in Ontario, left him in a coma for 3 weeks. The man survived but never walked right again. Troy did 18 months. Got out early for good behavior. The club recruited him 2 weeks after his release. He ran the Riverside chapter like a business, brutal and efficient. Protection rackets, drug routes, enforcement. You crossed Troy, you disappeared. Simple as that. He had a reputation for being cold, calculating, the kind of man who could order someone's death over breakfast and not lose his appetite. But Troy had a secret. Something he never talked about. Something that haunted him more than any of the violence he'd committed. His uncle, Raymond Madsen, had been one of the founding members of the Iron Ghosts. Raymond had ridden with Joel Raines, had saved his life in a bar fight in Tucson in 1972 when 3 guys jumped him with tire irons. Raymond put 2 of them in the hospital and scared the 3rd one so bad he left the state. Raymond was a legend. Tough as nails, loyal to a fault. The kind of man who'd give you his last dollar if you needed it, and break your jaw if you disrespected him. He raised Troy after Troy's father went to prison for armed robbery when Troy was 9. Taught him how to ride, how to fight, how to survive in a world that didn't give second chances. And on his deathbed in 1998, dying slowly from lung cancer, Raymond grabbed Troy's hand and told him one thing. Don't ever forget where you came from. Because the second you do, you're nothing. Troy never forgot those words. He repeated them to himself sometimes, late at night when he was alone. But somewhere along the way, he stopped living them. He built an empire, made money, earned fear, but he lost the one thing Raymond had tried to teach him. He lost respect for the legacy. And tonight, that was about to catch up with him. He was sitting in the back corner when Evelyn walked in, watching the whole thing unfold with a kind of cold amusement. When the enforcer looked back at him for instruction, Troy just nodded. Let her talk. Let her embarrass herself. Then get her out. But deep down, something about her unsettled him. The way she stood. The way she didn't flinch. It reminded him of someone. He just couldn't place who. Evelyn's voice cut through the noise. I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here to return something that was never mine to keep. Troy leaned forward. His voice was low, dangerous. Then leave it on the bar and walk out. You got 60 seconds. She didn't move. One of the younger guys, a kid maybe 25 with a fresh patch and an attitude bigger than his experience, stepped closer. His name was Devin. He'd been in the club for 8 months. Still thought being dangerous meant being loud. You deaf, lady? He said leave. That's when one of the older members, a man named Garrett, went quiet. He was standing near the bar, mid-drink, and his eyes locked onto the stitching on the vest Evelyn was holding. Hand-tooled leather. Old-school cross-stitch. A style that hadn't been used in decades. The kind of work that took hours. Days. The kind of work you only did for something that mattered. Garrett set his beard down slowly. His face changed. Not fear. Recognition. He'd seen that style before. A long time ago. In a photograph his mother kept hidden in a shoebox under her bed. A photograph of his father, a man he barely remembered, a man who died when Garrett was 8 years old. Have you ever walked into a room and felt the air change? Not because someone said something, but because something unspoken just shifted. Like the moment before a storm when the wind stops and everything goes still. That's what happened when Evelyn turned the vest around. The patch on the back wasn't large, wasn't flashy. It was simple, clean. A single rocker across the top that read Founding Widow. Below it, a date, 1969. And stitched into the leather in faded but unmistakable ink were 6 signatures. Names of men who'd built the foundation of what would become one of the most respected outlaw networks in Southern California. Men who'd ridden with Hell's Angels. Men who'd ridden against them. Men who'd earned their place in a world that didn't hand out respect for free. One of those names was Joel Raines. Another was Vincent Cross, a legend in the San Bernardino club scene who died in a shootout with police in 1978 after refusing to surrender during a raid on his clubhouse. There was Danny Ortega, who'd lost both legs in Vietnam and still rode a custom trike until the day he died of a heart attack in 1995. There was Lawrence Beck, who'd done 15 years in Folsom for manslaughter and came out harder, but never broken, never bitter. There was Michael Holt, who disappeared in 1981 after a run to Mexico and was never heard from again, his bike found abandoned on the side of a desert road. And at the bottom, smaller but still clear, was a name that made Troy's face go white. Raymond Madsen, his uncle, the man who'd raised him after his father went to prison, the man who'd taught him how to ride, how to fight, how to survive, the man Troy had claimed to honor every time he put on his cut. The room was silent now. No music, no laughter, no insults, just the sound of men breathing and the low hum of the refrigerator behind the bar. Someone's phone buzzed on a table. No one moved to check it. Garrett spoke first. His voice was low, almost reverent, like he was in church. Where did you get that? Evelyn looked at him. Not with anger, not with triumph, just with the weight of someone who'd carried something heavy for a very long time. My husband was one of the original 6. Frank Calder. Joel Raines gave me this vest the night we buried him. Told me to keep it safe. Said one day it might matter again. Troy stood up, slowly, his jaw tight, his hands clenched into fists. That's my uncle's name. I know, Evelyn said. Her voice was steady, kind, even. He signed this the same night. He told my husband that loyalty wasn't about who you rode with. It was about what you were willing to die for. Troy stepped forward. Closer now. Close enough that she could see the anger in his eyes. But also something else. Confusion. Shame. Fear. Why are you here? Evelyn's eyes didn't waver. Because Joel died 3 weeks ago. Pancreatic cancer. He fought it for 2 years, but it finally took him. And before he did, when he could barely speak, he called me to his bedside and told me to bring this here. To Riverside, to the men who carry the name. He said if they still remembered what it meant, they'd know what to do with it. If they didn't, then it didn't matter anyway. Troy's voice was barely a whisper. What do you want from us? Evelyn took a breath. I want you to remember. That's all. Just remember. You could see it on Troy's face. The anger, the shame, the realization that he'd just allowed his men to mock a woman carrying a piece of history his own blood had helped create. A woman who'd driven 400 miles to honor a promise made 40 years ago. A woman who had more courage in her silence than most of his men had in all their noise. He turned to the enforcer. Get out. The guy blinked. Confused. What? Troy's voice was thunder. I said get the hell out. Now. The enforcer looked around, waiting for someone to tell him this was a joke. No one did. He left. So did Devin, the kid with the attitude. So did half the room. The ones who stayed were the ones old enough to remember, old enough to understand, old enough to know that what was happening wasn't just about one woman or one vest. It was about the moment you realize you've become the thing you swore you'd never be. The moment you realize you've traded legacy for ego, respect for fear, brotherhood for power. Garrett stepped forward and placed his hand over his heart. a sign of respect. One by one, the others did the same. 8 men total, the oldest members of the chapter. Men who'd been around long enough to know what that patch meant, what those signatures represented. Troy stood there for a long moment, staring at the vest. Then, slowly, he removed his own cut and laid it on the bar. Not in surrender, in reverence. "I'm sorry," he said, and for the first time in years, he meant it. But Evelyn wasn't done. Not yet. Here's the second twist, and it's the one that changes everything. Evelyn reached into her bag again. This time, she pulled out a letter. Handwritten, dated 2 weeks before Joel's death. The paper was thin, yellowed, the ink slightly smudged in places like it had been written by a hand that was shaking. She handed it to Troy. He unfolded it carefully, his hands trembling. And then he read it aloud, his voice cracking with every line. To whoever leads the Riverside chapter. If you're reading this, I'm gone. And if Red brought you this vest, it means she kept her word. She always does. This patch was never about one club. It was about the idea that men who've been broken by the world can still build something that lasts. I don't care what name you ride under. I don't care what colors you wear. But if you've forgotten that respect is earned, not taken, then you don't deserve to wear anything at all. The vest goes to whoever understands that. And if that's no one, then burn it. At least it'll die honest. I've watched this life change. I've seen clubs rise and fall. I've seen brothers turn into strangers and strangers become family. But the one thing that never changes is this: loyalty outlives everything. It outlives ego. It outlives fear. It outlives the men who build it. If you're still living by that, then this vest is yours. If you're not, then you've already lost. Raymond knew that. Frank knew that. All the brothers knew that. And if you're reading this and you don't know what I'm talking about, then you've already answered the question. Ride free. Joel Raines. Troy folded the letter. His hands were shaking. He looked at Evelyn, and for the first time since she'd walked in, his face wasn't hard. It was broken. "What do you want us to do?" She smiled. "Small. Sad. Tired. I want you to remember. That's all. Just remember." But there's a third twist. And this one hits harder than the first two combined. Because as Evelyn turned to leave, Garrett called out, "Wait." She stopped. He walked over, pulled something from his wallet. A photo. Creased. Faded. Water damaged on one corner. Taken in 1970. It showed 6 men standing in front of a garage. Young. Proud. Alive. Cigarettes dangling from lips. Arms around shoulders. Bikes gleaming in the background. The kind of photo you take when you think you're going to live forever. Frank Calder was on the left, skinny, serious, a cigarette tucked behind his ear. Joel Raines in the center, grinning, one hand raised in a peace sign. And on the right, arm around Joel's shoulder, grinning like he owned the world, was a man Evelyn had never met, but whose face she recognized from the stories Frank used to tell. Garrett's father, Lawrence Beck. "He died when I was 8, Garrett said. His voice was barely holding together. Motorcycle accident. Ran off the road in the rain. I never knew what he did. My mom wouldn't talk about it. She burned everything. His cut. His photos. His trophies. Everything. She said she didn't want me following in his footsteps. Didn't want me ending up like him. But I kept this picture. Found it in the garage when I was cleaning out her house after she died 5 years ago. It was tucked inside an old toolbox, wrapped in oilcloth. And when I patched in, I kept it in my wallet. I didn't know why. I just did." He looked at the vest, at the signatures, at the date. His eyes were wet. "He's one of the 6, isn't he?" Evelyn stepped closer. She looked at the photo, at the man on the right, at the way he was smiling, at the way his arm was draped over Joel's shoulder like they were brothers. And then she smiled. A real smile. The first one since she'd walked into that bar. "Lawrence Beck, your father was a good man. Frank talked about him all the time. Said he was the toughest guy he ever met. And the kindest. Said he once stopped in the middle of a run to help a woman change a tire on the side of the highway in the middle of nowhere. Spent 2 hours in the heat getting her back on the road. Didn't ask for anything. Didn't even tell her his name. That's who your father was. Garrett's voice cracked. Then this belongs to me too. Evelyn reached out and placed her hand on his. It belongs to all of you. If you want it. Troy looked at Garrett. At the photo. At the vest. And something shifted in him. Something he thought he'd lost a long time ago. He picked up his cut from the bar. Put it back on. And then he did something no one expected. He knelt. Right there in front of Evelyn. Not in submission. In respect. The other men followed. One by one. 8 men. Hard men. Dangerous men. Men who'd spent their lives taking what they wanted and breaking anyone who got in their way. Kneeling in front of an old woman who'd driven 400 miles to remind them of something they'd forgotten. What happened next wasn't loud. Wasn't violent. Wasn't dramatic. Troy stood up. Walked to the wall where the chapter's founding plaque hung. A cheap thing. Brass with fake engraving. The kind you buy at a trophy shop. Something they put up when the chapter formed 15 years ago to make themselves feel legitimate. He took it down, looked at it for a moment, then tossed it in the trash, and mounted the vest in its place. Under glass, under light, centered on the wall where every man who walked into that bar would see it the moment they entered. And remember, Evelyn didn't say goodbye. She just walked out the same way she walked in. Alone, calm, carrying nothing but the memory of a promise kept. The bar stayed silent for a long time after she left. Some men cried. Some just stared. Troy sat back down and didn't speak for the rest of the night. He just looked at that vest, at his uncle's name, at the date, at the signatures of men who'd built something real in a world that told them they were nothing. And he thought about all the things he'd forgotten, all the things he'd lost along the way, all the compromises he'd made, all the lines he'd crossed, all the things he'd done in the name of power that had nothing to do with respect. The next morning, he made a call to every chapter in the region. Hell's Angels, Outlaws, Mongols, Bandidos, Vagos, didn't matter. Clubs that had been at war with each other for decades. Clubs that wouldn't normally be caught dead in the same room. He told them what had happened, what he'd learned, what he'd almost lost, and he invited them to ride. Within a month, 17 different clubs, some rivals, some allies, held rides in Joel's honor, in Frank's honor, in honor of the men whose names were stitched into that vest, in honor of the idea that some things matter more than territory or reputation or pride. They rode through Riverside, through Barstow, through every town those men had ever called home. Hundreds of bikes, thousands of riders, all flying different colors. Red and white, black and white, black and gold. It didn't matter. For one day, none of that mattered, because they were riding for something bigger than territory or reputation. They were riding for the brothers who came before, for the ones who built the foundation, for the ones who understood that loyalty isn't loud. It's quiet. It's showing up. It's keeping your word even when no one's watching. It's honoring the dead by living right. Evelyn didn't attend any of the rides. She went home, back to Ohio, back to her quiet life, back to her classroom where she taught fourth graders and graded papers and lived the simple life she'd always known. But 3 months later, she got a package in the mail. No return address, just her name and address written in careful block letters. Inside was a photo, taken at the Riverside ride. Hundreds of bikes lined up in formation stretching as far as the camera could see. And in the front, carrying a banner between 2 bikes, was Troy and Garrett. Side by side, the banner read, "In memory of the Iron Ghosts. Loyalty outlives everything." At the bottom, written in marker, was a note. "Thank you for reminding us who we're supposed to be. We won't forget again. Raymond would be proud. Your brothers in Riverside." Evelyn put the photo on her mantle, next to the picture of Frank, next to the flag from his funeral. And every morning when she woke up, she looked at it, and she smiled, because she'd kept her promise. And in keeping it, she'd done something she never expected. She'd reminded a room full of dangerous men that the most dangerous thing you can lose isn't your reputation. It's your soul. 6 months later, Troy called her. She almost didn't answer. Didn't recognize the number, but something told her to pick up. His voice was different, softer. "I wanted you to know something," he said. "We've changed. Not overnight. Not all at once. But we're trying. We stopped the protection rackets. Cut ties with the drug suppliers. Started doing charity rides for veteran organizations. Started mentoring younger guys, teaching them what it really means to be a brother. And every time someone new patches in, we bring them to that vest. We tell them the story. We tell them about Joel and Frank and Raymond and all the men who built this life on something real. And we tell them about you. About the woman who walked into a room full of men who would have hurt her and didn't flinch. Because she had something more powerful than fear. She had a promise to keep. Evelyn didn't say much, just listened. And when he was done, she said one thing. Your uncle would be proud. Troy's voice broke. I hope so. That was 2 years ago. Evelyn is 73 now. Still teaching. Still writing, though not as much as she used to. Her knees aren't what they were. But every summer, on the anniversary of Frank's death, she takes his old bike out of the garage. She has a mechanic keep it running. And she rides. Just her. Just the road. Just the wind and the memories and the promise that even after all these years, she still keeps. Last summer, she got another letter. This time from Garrett. He'd left the Hells Angels. Not in anger. Not in shame. Just moved on. He wrote that he'd started his own small club. 5 guys. All veterans. All trying to find their way. He called it the Iron Ghosts. In honor of his father. In honor of the men who'd shown him what brotherhood really means. He asked for her blessing. She gave it. And she sent him something. A piece of leather. Cut from an old jacket Frank used to wear. With a note. Build something that lasts. And when you're gone, make sure someone remembers why it mattered. Garrett framed that piece of leather. Hung it in his garage. And every time he rides, he carries it with him. A reminder. That legacy isn't something you inherit. It's something you earn. Every single day. By the choices you make. By the promises you keep. By the way you treat the people who can't do anything for you. So let me ask you this. How many of us are walking around wearing the name of something we've stopped honoring? How many of us claim loyalty but live like it's negotiable? How many of us talk about brotherhood but treat people like they're disposable? And if someone walked into your life carrying the weight of something you'd forgotten, would you have the courage to listen? Or would you laugh them out of the room? Would you have the strength to admit you were wrong? To change? To become the person you said you were going to be? Because that's what this story is really about. It's not about motorcycles or patches or clubs. It's about the moment you realize that the only thing that outlives you is what you stood for. And if you didn't stand for anything, then what was the point? What's your take on this? Comment below. I'm reading every single one. If this story resonated with you, hit the like and send it to someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more stories like this, stories about real people making real choices that matter, check out the previous videos on the channel. Because we all need reminders. We all need to be called back to who we said we were going to be. And sometimes, it takes an old woman with a vest and a promise to show us the way.